Mars and the sixth house. Well, there's two parts to this puzzle. Mars and the sixth house. If you're clear about what each of them means separately, then it'll be much easier to be clear about what they mean together. So, this is the sixth house. It's the part of the sky that's in the western section, but on the lower border. So it's the part of the sky that's just below the western horizon. Everything about the sixth house comes from the fact that it's under the west, and the west is where the sun sets. So sixth house signifies things that support or hold up the sunset. And since the sunset symbolizes disappearance and other people, this is where we get all the specific meanings of the sixth house. For example, it's the house of enemies, enmity, fighting, contest, struggle. Because it's the house that supports other people. Being pro someone else implies being anti you. It's also why this is the house of debts and how we are indebted to people, the chores that we have to perform, the work that we have to do, the service that we do for others. In other words, it's about the way our money and our work benefit other people more than it benefits us. So it can have to do with the whole spectrum of things depending on how good the sixth house is doing. A spectrum can range from stuff like exploitation, slavery, to employment, to volunteer service. Now, how about the fact that the sunset represents disappearance, and disappearance means death? So that's why the sixth house supporting the sunset is the house of things that support or lead to death. That's why it's the house of illness. Disappearance also means not being able to see something or losing something. So the sixth house represents things that lead to losing or not obtaining things. So it has to do with uncertainty, doubt, confusion, and problems. Now that is what we need to know about the sixth house to be able to understand Mars in the sixth house. But we should also get our bearings straight about what Mars itself represents. Mars fundamentally represents masculinity, and masculinity has two facets to it: independence and inceptivity. So Mars symbolizes everything which is all about independence, individuality, and freedom. This is why it symbolizes self-reliance, the capacity to be independent. And this is why it symbolizes strength, what you need to be self-reliant, which is what you need to be independent. And this is why Mars has everything to do with stuff that makes us stronger. So muscle is one thing, but also weapons, things that extend the strength. Also tools. Also machines and technologies. And Mars signifies conflict because it's all about strong, self-reliant, independent, individualistic people. So in circles with different centers overlap each other and clash. So Mars has to do with clashing between people and conflicting. Besides being independent, masculinity is also inceptive. This is why Mars is the planet of initiative. It has a lot of ambition and it wants to do things now. And that's why Mars symbolizes passion and lust and hunger and all the motivations to do it. And this is why Mars is brave. Bravery, courage, confidence means I am willing to take that risky first step to get something started, to get what I want. And finally, Mars represents command, because command is actually the outcome of confidence. So Mars has a very dominant, decisive nature, decisive as a result of confidence, not necessarily as a result of learning, scholarship, or intelligence. Now, we understand the sixth house, and we understand Mars, and what I promised was if you understand the two of those, you should be able to make sense of Mars in the sixth house. So let's see if I can follow through on that promise. All that we need to do is put the symbolism of Mars side by side with the symbolism of the sixth house, and ask ourselves where they are talking about the same thing or exactly the opposite thing. For example, Mars is all about conflict. It symbolizes conflict. And the sixth house symbolizes fighting because it has to do with dealing with enemies and dealing with problems. So Mars really fits well in the sixth house because it's a masculine, strong, independent, conflict comfortable planet, conflict enjoying planet, in a place where it will be presented with many conflicts and many problems to solve and many enemies to defeat. So basically, Mars is the perfect match for the sixth house. Mars also represents decisions, and the sixth house represents problems, things that you have to make decisions about and take action on. So again, Mars is the planet that likes to solve a problem, make a decision, conquer an enemy, conquer a problem, and it's in the sixth house where it's going to have a lot of opportunity to do that. Finally, Mars represents freedom, but the sixth house represented being exploited, being put into servitude and slavery. So now here's an example where they're talking about opposite things. Mars is all about freedom, and the sixth house is all about servitude, slavery. But in light of the context of how well Mars is doing with solving the problems of the sixth house and overcoming the enemies that are there, it will probably symbolize something good about freedom versus slavery. So now let's take those three seeds of what Mars in the sixth house represents and sprout them a little bit so we can see what they look like in a basic sentence or in basic words. In order to fully get the fruit out of these seeds, we need to put them into a complete chart to understand the whole soil of the whole chart. But to get an initial sprout of meaning out of these three seeds, we can still just stick with the theory of what Mars in the fifth house represents in a void of context. So Mars is conflict and the fifth house is fighting. This is great. This is a good seed. Something about this person is going to enjoy conquering their opponents. So what does that look like as a sprout of an interpretation? Well, here's a strong person. Here's a dominant person, a victorious person, a capable person, a person who's capable of dealing with problems, capable of dealing with enemies. They don't shrink in the face of danger, in the face of opposition. They are actually independent and self-reliant, and on their own, they can overcome a lot of challenges. Another thing is Mars makes decisions, and the sixth house presents problems. What does that seed look like when it starts to sprout? It looks like a confident person. It looks like a person who doesn't get paralyzed when there's choices to make. It looks like a person who makes decisions and therefore doesn't hesitate. They're active. They're quick. They make a choice and they get to it. Therefore, they wind up in the front of the pack. They wind up leading other people. Mars is all about freedom, and the sixth house is about slavery. But since Mars is doing so good in the sixth house, the seed will probably grow well also. So these are people who don't succumb to domination, and they don't succumb to slavery and servitude and exploitation. They're individualistic, they're free, unbound, and they're unique people. Who are some people who are well known with confirmed birth times, with tropical signs and whole sign houses, who have Mars in the sixth house? How about Lionel Messi and Karl Marx? They really put a good face on all of these traits, but especially on the dominant, capable, independent, strong aspect of Mars in the sixth house. How about Copernicus, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and Edgar Cayce? These are people with an interesting intellect. These are really confident people who do things very differently and think very differently from others. How about Frida Kahlo, Jack Black, and Hugh Hefner? Of course, they all exemplify all these qualities of Mars in the sixth, but I particularly feel like these three exemplify the freedom versus slavery aspect. They're very individualistic. They're very free and unbound by conventions. Now, Copernicus is a genius, right? And Edgar Cayce is a psychic. So maybe we should find some way to fit in here that Mars in the sixth makes you a genius and a psychic. Don't do that. Don't work backwards from the person to the chart. Work from the chart to the person. Let's look at these two individuals and see why they are what they are and why Mars in the sixth isn't the major factor contributing to those things about them. Copernicus. Why is he a genius? Is it Mars in the sixth house? Not really. It's more like he's got a Virgo ascendant. Isn't that simple? And on top of the Virgo ascendant, he has Mercury, the first lord, aspecting the ascendant while in a Neech Bhang Raj Yoga, which means its debilitation has been reversed as a result of conjunction with exalted Venus, who is the ninth lord. So he's got an extremely profound first house and first lord Virgo and Mercury. There is your textbook smart person. Furthermore, his fifth lord, which is really important for understanding somebody's intelligence, his fifth lord aspects that Mercury from Gemini in the 10th house. And it also aspects his moon. The fifth lord aspects his moon from Gemini, and it also mutually aspects his planet of wisdom and learning, Jupiter. So that whole context of that whole chart explains why Copernicus is a genius. It's not reliant on his Mars in the sixth house. Mars in the sixth house is why he was unique, individualistic, and went against the grain. Caused a revolution. Edgar Cayce, he's a psychic. Why is he a psychic? It's not about Mars in the sixth house. Look at this chart. It's like an eighth house extravaganza. So that explains that. Furthermore, his eighth lord is in Neech Bhang Raja Yoga, just with that Mars in the sixth house, and his exalted moon is the only planet that is in the central position. So that explains why he's a psychic. It doesn't have to do with his Mars in the sixth house, but Mars in the sixth house made him not succumb to norms, not succumb to conventions, not become a part of the mainstream.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.